Yes, thanks everyone. I'd like to start actually by thanking the Bell Foundation for inviting NALDIC, because it's great to be part of a collective effort to support the profession while this challenging period's going on. I'd like to start with a bit of a caveat as well, which is that although we can all helpfully give some ideas and some suggestions to help, obviously none of us have experience of teaching children during a global pandemic, so we're kind of all in this together. That said, I want to share with you some of the fundamental elements of great practice for EAL in primary classrooms that I hope can translate to useful strategies for you to use in remote teaching. And my beliefs and understanding about great teaching for EAL come from a combination of my own practitioner experiences and my partnership working with great local authority teams like Hampshire MTAS and my research with teachers in the UK and the US. So the elements of effective practice for EAL in a primary classroom that I would name are that it considers current levels of proficiency for children and where they need to go next as a starting point. It uses home languages where possible, because proficiency in home languages is going to support proficiency in English. It takes a talk-based and conversational role as a route into literacy and into conceptual understanding in subjects other than English. It focuses on vocabulary development, both breadth of vocabulary, how many words do I know, and depth of vocabulary, can I use those words in the right circumstances? And it draws on children's experiences, both in school and at home, to give a clear and meaningful context to any activity. So my key messages for today in terms of thinking about how those elements translate into virtual activities are probably just think about the language demands of your lesson, what vocabulary do children need to access lessons, and think about where you can make activities talk-based rather than writing-based, and where can you make things visual and concrete. That's me for now.
Thank you very much, Naomi. So, Kamil, over to you on EAL for secondary education. Your key thoughts.
Thank you very much, Silvana. So first of all, thank you very much for supporting EAL learners during these particularly difficult and unusual and trying times. I will speak from the secondary perspective, and to me, there seem to be three aspects that appear the most important to consider when we are thinking about our actions during this time. So the first one is that ensuring that learners with EAL continue to be exposed to good English language models throughout this time. Obviously, they will be at home, so they'll be communicating with their own family members in their first language, and that's obviously not to say that the first language is not important, but their exposure to English language will be limited throughout this time. And so that kind of lessened exposure is likely to impact on their attainment and progress. And so it is important in primary as well, obviously, but it seems that it's more pressing with sort of GCSE examinations at the end of the secondary, so the number of years is shorter. Although GCSEs in 2020 have been cancelled, the EAL learners will, as any other learners, will be able to still sit those in the following academic year. And so their exposure to English language is even more important, given that they won't be in those physical classrooms during this particular time. The second thing is, obviously, we'll need to think about Band A learners, the new to English learners. Those learners would often be in EAL induction classes. And so we want to think and rethink how to provide such EAL induction programs to those learners at this time, which is obviously very, very challenging. But still, so again, this feels more pressing in secondary school because GCSEs are just around the corner. And finally, just thinking about the topic and title of our webinar, it is also after school closures. So I'm thinking here in May and June, there very often is primary and secondary transition time in schools, and that is very likely not going to happen. So given that the schools are closed, well, it's probably going to just simply not be something that's going on. So thinking ahead, we might want to have some full knowledge about who the EAL learners in our schools are going to be in September. So we have some kind of information about them when all of this hopefully finishes. And so it might not be the instant priority, but establishing that communication would be useful for September as well. So
thank you very much, Kamil. Yvonne, would you like to give us your perspective on teacher education?
Yeah, I'm Yvonne Foley, and a lot of my work in Edinburgh is based on the initial teacher education programs, and also working in the community with in-service teachers, mainly within the secondary area. But my main interest, and especially as we've been working with student teachers, as the pandemic has unfolded, their courses have been cut short. And so looking for ways to support them as they are no longer able to go on placement, and the fact that they've now started to emphasize the fact that EAL learners seem to have been missed off the agenda when it comes to provision for any learners at all. So my interests around that have been looking at ways to work with student teachers on how we support the language and literacies for multilingual classrooms, and to consider the fact that previously, when there have been barriers to pedagogical barriers or cultural barriers and borders around practices, this pandemic has raised another border around how they're able to access teaching and learning. And so it's looking for activities that open up authentic dialogue, particularly with the secondary level pupils that they're teaching. Looking at ways to allow free text on social media, whether we use apps to do that, whether it's looking at L1 or first language reflections and stories and how we help to approach them, and thinking of the literacy pedagogies that enable a sense of belonging when they're cut off from their peers, when they're cut off from meaningful contexts, and activities in text that would help to support that. And we've been looking at using Sean Tan in terms of picture books in order to support a visual representation of text, but to engage in authentic dialogue around some of the key issues that these books and texts raise. So it's helped us to explore what that means within this situation, and to look at ways of addressing some of the needs that have come up.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And last but not least, Constant on EAL assessment, please. Constant, can you turn on your mic, please?
Lesson number 1, turn your mic on. It's good to see everybody and hear everybody. My part of this is pretty much concerned with the uses of teacher assessment. But I will perhaps add to what my colleagues will have to say about what they have to say about the use of reading and the importance of multilingualism in this period, when some of our students will have a prolonged and intensive exposure to, for example, the home language and so on, and see how we might best make use of that opportunity. But first of all, I'd like to simply flag up the fact that the recent publication by Ofqual on the use of teacher assessment in lieu of examinations at GCSE and A-level is itself very well-meaning, well-intended. But in relation to EAL, the advice is, I guess, the best way to say it is opaque, and in some sense very, very unclear as to what is meant by the statement. I'll come back to this later towards the end if there's time. But essentially, the advice is for teachers when they make judgments in relation to the likely achievement of all their pupils at GCSE and A-level exams. In relation to EAL, they say we should consider the language acquisition that students would have been making by the time they get to the exam, and how this might be reflected in their judgment. Now, this is really very difficult and probably doesn't make any sense to any secondary teacher. But I think the point is bigger than that. It's not so much not useful for the secondary teachers, because EAL is not an examination, doesn't have any specific test, has no curriculum, and doesn't have any teaching provision properly in terms of a timetable, slot, and so on. These are things that we all know. So in some sense, I think the advice reflects a degree of perhaps lack of understanding of what EAL is within certainly the English context. Probably, what I'm saying might have some relevance to colleagues working in Wales and also in Scotland too, because there isn't any national recognition. So it's very difficult to say, well, find out what it is that they have learned in EAL and how this is reflected, because most of the students we are talking about are actually assessed through the subject content, not through EAL. So therefore, we need to be thinking about how, as teachers, we make sense of students' performance in their subject, and how that may be fed into our predictions of their achievement, in this year. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is an opportunity for families to get together to begin to pay some attention to, if you like, more conscious use of their home language or languages. It is clearly important for pupils to have extensive exposure to English in the schooling years, but equally it's important for them to have a reasonably good amount of exposure and use in their home language or languages. And I shall try to say a little bit about the particular set of resources that might also be very helpful. But for now, I'll give way to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Constant, and every member of the panel. Lots of food for thought and hopefully triggering some questions in you, which you can start typing on the chat box below. Let's now move to the questions from the participants, and I'll start first with questions that some of you sent in advance. So the first question is for Naomi, and it's from Deirdre, and she says, I have one group of EAL learners who only started learning English in September. They are between the ages of 9 and 11 and from 3 different countries, Afghanistan, Kurdistan and Brazil. They are not literate in their home languages and their parents have limited English with which to assist them. I would be grateful for any ideas on how to work with this group remotely. Our school is using Google Classroom. Naomi.
Thanks for your question, Deirdre. And first of all, it's great that you can say they're not literate in their home languages, because that shows how much you know that you should be knowing about your pupils. So I was really pleased to see that sentence in there, even though I know that's a cause of anxiety for you. I've thought about a range of things. The first thing is an online thing you might go to. So NALDIC's EAL Journal has a blog online, and we've crowdsourced a number of resources which you might want to go and look at, one of which is a set of links through to things that are specifically for working with new to English learners. So that might have some useful ideas in it for you. Another thing I thought about was to what extent can you make responses visual? Can you make things that are, for example, film-based or picture-based for them rather than language-based, so that they get through that kind of language barrier? Open University, for example, has a great app called Our Story, whereby they can make stories up using photos on their phones and then put basic text in underneath it. Those are great ones. I wondered also to what extent their phonic knowledge was developed. If they're so new to English and they're at the end of Key Stage 2, then we really want to be sure they're going through with a quite good knowledge of the English alphabet and their letter sound correspondences. And can some of the work be phonic based? It probably is, but that, you know, don't leave phonics behind. On the other hand, don't leave reading comprehension behind either. And another thing I can tell you about is that there are a lot of sites, again listed in the EAL NALDIC blog journal post about this, that are letting their online books in many languages available to teachers and families. So Mantralingua is one of those, for example, that has books for free until the end of August, but there are many others. So think about that as well as possibilities. Finally, I wondered if, do you actually have local authority links? I know very few of us work in local authorities that still have EAL teams, but there are some great EAL teams in local authorities out there. Hampshire I've already mentioned, Glasgow, Solihull, I'm sure there are many others, West Berkshire I know, that have their own websites and things on them that might well also be able to give you advice if you're operating with a small number there. I hope that's helpful. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that one.
Anybody? Oh, Constant? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. Here's just a thought of using what is, I think, quite standardly available technology. We could think in terms of if we have very important messages or very important bits of curriculum content that we want to help our pupils with, but they are at a relatively early stage, so therefore the written language in English, or in any language indeed, may not be all that helpful. So therefore, the content meaning will have to be rendered through the spoken language. And I think this is going to be time consuming, but it is something that's possible. If there's something that's really important and the message must be conveyed, then think of, the standard PowerPoint format. The PowerPoint actually has a recording facility attached to each of the slides. You can put, if you like, a PDF image into the PowerPoint display box itself. And then you can make a recording of what you want to say initially, obviously in English, or you could do it the other way around. And you can write, using that perfectly imperfect tool called Google Translate, okay? You can write the message in English and click on, let's just say, Russian or Punjabi or whatever. And then you have the translation, and then you can click on the voice, which will then read the text out in that language, and that can be recorded. And that could be a sound file that you can attach also to the PowerPoint. So in this way, in a very, very difficult situation, that kind of use of standard technology can actually be very helpful. But of course, this depends on whether the pupil and their family, whether they have any kind of digital equipment at all. But here's certainly one thought that we could use if there's something very important and it's worth spending a little bit of time in getting the message over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Constant. Another question for Naomi. Catherine Tinkler asks, are you able to advise of any specific EAL math sites or resources that children can access from home, or even anything for children transitioning to high school? For the latter, she's just thinking about some of the year 6 who weren't going to sit SATs.
Hi, Catherine, and thanks for your question. I have to say, I don't know any specific maths and EAL sites. I'll just say that up front. But one thing I think is important to think about is the extent to which language and mathematics go together, and that the focus should, for your EAL learners, be on ensuring that they understand the language of mathematics. So thinking about that very specific subject-specific vocabulary. And so maybe it's a matter of giving your children more word-based problems so that you can really unpick with them their comprehension of, I don't know, what does perpendicular actually mean and so on, because the vocabulary is key to access. I think also try and encourage pupils maybe at home with their parents that it's fine to work in first language, because it's better that they sort out what the mathematical concepts are and the subject knowledge is in their first language if that's more accessible for them for the understanding the maths. I think definitely encourage home languages there. Make things concrete as far as possible in terms of providing visual cues, and make things culturally familiar and relevant in terms of examples. I don't have an actual website though. Maybe somebody else has a maths and EAL website.
Anybody? You can also, participants, you can also type on the chat box if you know of any that you would like to recommend.
Thanks. I can see Catherine's just typed in, Catherine from Bell's just typed in Bell's own resources, which are, of course, absolutely brilliant as well for lots of things.
Thank you. Another question from Becky Clark, Naomi. What would you advise parents of EAL pupils who have little English themselves in terms of homeschooling, and where can they go for support?
This is such a hard one, and again, I don't have a magic bullet answer for this one. I'm working intensively with a great school in Southampton, Mount Pleasant Junior School, which has 98% of children EAL, and we've been working a lot on getting their shifting their pedagogy, working together on that. What they're doing at the moment is they're just prioritising communication with parents as the things that senior leaders are really engaged in. So there's a lot of email, phone contact. I was talking with the head earlier today, actual visiting homes to make sure that parents understand things, as simple as the COVID-19 distancing problem, regulations in their home languages, because those are issues way above what children are learning. So it's prioritising communication. It's keeping things consistent. So they're making sure that the things they send home look like the things that they always did send home as far as possible. They're using children's homework books that were already in use, as it were, so that there's that consistency there. They've also opened a YouTube channel. And with the YouTube channel, they're showing short films that might help with things that the children are learning that are new. Teachers are doing things like modelling new concepts and so on through this YouTube channel. I thought that was a particularly good one, and hopefully YouTube is available even on devices like phones for people that don't have access to computers. And finally, they're working with a local community radio station to let parents know things, and the community radio station, which is a multilingual radio station, but largely serving a Urdu-speaking population, is doing things like Urdu storytelling. So a lot of thinking, beyond the school gates going
Thank you,
on,
Naomi.
really. But it's not easy.
Great
a lot
ideas.
of work.
Thank you. Okay, for the time being, we're going to go over to Kamil. There are more questions for you, Naomi, later. Kamil, Clara, way good, and Nadine have similar questions, so I kind of put those together. So they say, I have 3 students who joined at the beginning of March who are all learning English for the first time. They're all band A's with very limited prior knowledge of English. And Clara says, I've set them vocabulary and simple writing tasks, but even then, they're only completing some of the work, and there are misunderstandings in how to complete it. So how can we best support our secondary students who are at the very beginner stage, band A, to learn English in terms of resources for them to do independently and giving feedback with an inevitable language barrier?
Thank you, Clara, for asking that question. Obviously, I would just reiterate whatever I'm going to say. It's not a magic bullet, just like Naomi just said, but I have a couple of ideas, I think. First of all, to do with the vocabulary development, there's a website called Quizlet.com. It's not specific to EAL, but it seems to the kind of thing that could be useful. So you're able to essentially have lists of vocabulary, and they have activities that students can do from a device or from a computer. So it will work on mobiles and tablets around it. So they have annotated diagrams, flashcards, writing and spelling and matching activities, and obviously it is a website designed for general English language teaching. But obviously you can enter your own words related to what you're teaching, and they do, and the students will get immediate feedback on what they are doing. But also you as a teacher will have statistics in terms of how they are doing, and how they are progressing. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that you might want to consider letting your students write the first version of their writing in their first language, and then later on translating into English. They could, I would discourage translating full sentences in Google Translate for obvious reasons, but writing that first version of their work in their first language would actually go around that issue. I think that they wouldn't have it complete, because as long as they understand what they are being asked to do, then they should be able to write the whole thing in their first language. And also that's why we can also involve the parents in the work. Those parents for whom that English language barrier might be there as well. Then some other things you could do is would consider using a simplified marking code, and I will marking code to do with language specifically. So things like are you using the right verb and that sort of thing, and perhaps even use some images around this, so it's more understandable what you are telling them. And if it's simple enough, you would be able to translate the sort of short explanations of these codes using Google Translate into their language. And finally, just last thing about that, we actually have, in terms of students understanding instructions, which is obviously a concern with teaching in this way to Band A learners. We actually have on our website now a Giving Instructions YouTube video. So we now have a home learning related site. So if you go to that, there's a banner on the front page, and it will link to that section. And so one of these, so I'm not going to actually, but thinking about using visuals, using examples for your instructions, for example. So if you're asking, if you're giving a student an instruction, why not have a simple example of one sentence, what it is that you're actually asking them to do, and then they can try to replicate that. Breaking longer instructions into shorter, kind of quicker phrases or short sentences with imperatives, those kinds of things. And finally, the last idea here, perhaps it is possible to video yourself actually showing them what to do. And then sharing that video with them. So those would be my.
Thank you very much, Kamil. Another question from Nadine. The longer lockdown carries on, the concern I have is listening activities, as there is a slim likelihood Band A pupils are able to be exposed to a large amount of verbal English if they're at home with family who do not speak English. So what is the best method to support Band A new to English pupils during school closures? Should we be focusing on building basic English skills within each subject? So for example, to focus on building scientific vocabulary and writing in a scientific style, or is there another suggestion from you?
So thank you very much, Nadine. That's a very good question. I think here as well we could use our learners' first language ability, and then there are websites out there such as TED Talks and Khan Academy, and so what they have, all of these, or almost all of these, are delivered in the English language, but you have this huge amounts of subtitles in all sorts of languages. I think TED Talks has something like 50. They also come with transcripts very often. So all of these videos are on academic content and topic, and so again, students will be able to also talk about them first with their families. But the idea is that they're going to understand this because they have the subtitles in their language, but it is actually listening to English content. So we can use that. And then in terms of which kind of language should we focus on? So I think focusing on building academic vocabulary is always good. So I would say that. But I would also sort of encourage you to think about different kinds of language that EAL learners might need. So if you think about the kind of vocabulary that is very specific to different academic domains, like for example onomatopoeia in English or photosynthesis in science, that's one set of language. But then there are those other words that seem to be, they are academic, but they function across different domains. So for example, to circle something or to analyze something, you will come across this. So it would be perhaps a good idea to sort of consider which of these do you think are more important for those learners to know. And coming back to these TED Talks and Khan Academy things, in terms of devising some kind of activities around this, for example, you could take the transcript that is there and turn this into gap-filling activity very easily, I think. So they're sort of, so these websites are quite useful. And the final thing is, if you wish to sort of focus not on just words, but obviously building sentences, then you would need to provide some kind of additional support strategies. So you could use things like substitution tables, sentence frames, sentence starters. And there is one very good website there, which I'm going to put this link that I'm able to into the chat box. It's called Scramblinator, which basically can sort of provide those sort of activities for them where they need to unscramble word sentences or whole paragraphs, so they can sort of play with the sentences that perhaps you can provide, but then they need to figure out the word order of sentences. So hopefully some of these ideas are
Thank you. Lots of practical ideas. Does anybody else from the panel want to come in on this? Right. Thank you very much. Finally, Kamil, what is the best way to support B, early acquisition pupils who have enough basic skills to be able to complete simple tasks independently, but struggle to produce large amounts of work without verbal instructions and support from classroom teachers or TAs? And Nadine says, we have tried using voiceovers in PowerPoint, but not all teachers are able to do this, and Zoom live lessons are not allowed in our setting.
So this was this is a question which I thought I had to sort of think sort of back to what I know. So first of all, there's some very simple things that you could do with this. The first one is that Microsoft Word actually has a read aloud function, and so basically whatever instruction you would write, it can be read out to your learners. So that's a kind of a simple thing to just communicate, where they basically highlight a piece of text in words, so that there will be your instruction, or perhaps addressing a question that they have written, and they can play this back to themselves. And then, of course, they would also, as Constance said, these kinds of things are translatable. But there's some other websites that are very good for actually communicating with others, so you could use them for that in sort of audio kind of way. There's a website called Clip, that's clyp.it. And essentially what it does is that you're able to record yourself very short kind of clip, and then you get a specific URL that only they can access, and they can listen to that. So essentially you record it, save it, and then you're able to basically copy paste for them the sort of link which will actually get them to hear your comments. So that's another thing. And actually something else that's already been mentioned, which is YouTube. Now, obviously, again, I don't know if YouTube is allowed, given that in the question you said that Zoom live lessons are not possible. But first of all, it will be possible to set up a YouTube channel that is private only for that learner, and actually record yourself, the response to what they are actually asking you, and have a conversation that way. And then they could obviously write down another question in the comments of that YouTube video, and so that's possible. And for other practitioners who perhaps are able to use live lessons, then YouTube comes with a sort of a live conversation, live webinar sort of functionality there. So there's lots of politicians and sort of MPs that use that sort of thing, where basically they are live for 1 hour, and then obviously people can come in and ask them questions. So perhaps that also can be used if you are able to do that.
Thank you, Kamil. I'll give you a rest now, and I'll talk to Yvonne for a little while. In the meantime, maybe if you have the time and the links, it would be great if you could add. Okay. Over to Yvonne now. Yvonne, there's a question for you here from Helen Drummond. As EAL teachers, do we need to review our pedagogy and approach when supporting schools and class teachers with advice and resources to provide a language-based approach to curriculum learning? She's talking about mainstream primary schools for learners with EAL in the context of school closures. What advice do you have about supporting differentiation, scaffolding, access to the UK curriculum for learners with EAL learning in a remote home learning context, and a context where there may be limited digital access and language barriers to accessing home learning? A long question, sorry, Yvonne.
No, thank you for that question, Helen. It's an interesting one. And I think to be honest with you, I think within these circumstances, there's only so much that we can do. And I've watched the teachers that I've been engaging with, including student teachers and teachers within the community. It's looking at what is reasonable and what is possible given the circumstances, because as teachers we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves to keep going and perform as business as usual. But there are some strategies that we can use and some approaches with teachers that we can use in order to build on the work that you've already been doing with teachers, and that is to remind them of the principles that shape the pedagogy of EAL, but also how that links with their own pedagogic practice. And it's a good time for reflection as they're having to really think through lesson plans and tasks and activities in a very different way. So I think some of the principles that we would highlight in terms of first language use, in terms of talk-based activities and visuals that have already been mentioned, and also in terms of activities that ensure personal engagement with the learner and with the teacher themselves. Because I think that some of the teachers that I've been working with, just to share some of the creative ways that they've been trying to engage with pupils across online forum, is they've looked at trying to instill a much more project-based approach. And so talking to teachers about ensuring that there's a project-based way of engaging with text or subject content areas. And that allows for a much more open-ended approach to an activity rather than it being rooted right into a curricular focus where there's certain answers that we need to achieve. This maybe gives us a little bit more scope to engaging with personal engagement and to give some freedom around how we construct activities and the types of answers that we're expecting. Some of the project-based approaches have been inquiry-based, and they're not only asking questions, but they're encouraging ideas from learners and also with the teachers, and looking at ways to ensure a kind of analysis takes place so that you're engaging at what they might call lower level thinking skills, but then making sure that the teacher is developing tasks that engage much higher order thinking skills in terms of that. Some of the activities have been exploring, just as an example, have been working with teachers to say how can we engage the content of what's happening around us, because they're immersed in this, they're sitting in homes trying to engage in learning and exploring the discourses that are around either the types of situations we find ourselves in, how language has been used to construct that, and helping teachers to design activities around that where their students are engaged in counter texting. And so that's responding to the text by looking at what voices are missing within a text, how we help to explore these much more inquiry-based approaches by looking at what messages are not being given, whose voice is missing, how is gender being constructed in a particular way. So they're adapting the activities that they do by using a much more inquiry-based approach. Other things that they've been supporting teachers with is looking at the development of vocabulary and talk, and to extensively use graphic organizers as a way of providing a workbench for learners, and so that they're able to take their time looking at their first language use of the word, considering in terms of how it's used in English, developing a much more bilingual scaffold in order to support the development of vocabulary, what associations are made with it, so that you're learning the word in its entirety and not just as a kind of denotative meaning in order to achieve a curriculum task. So it's speaking to the teachers about how to broaden their pedagogic principles and to not see EAL as another pedagogy they have to learn, but that they're developing a repertoire of pedagogies that will be supportive for all circumstances, depending on where they find themselves. So those are just some of the thoughts that we've had and some of the things we've been engaging with so far. I think I mentioned earlier about Sean Tan's books. Those are on YouTube, and he's also got a website where you can access picture books. And those have become quite a platform for teachers that have felt a much more activist approach, and they wanted to embed that within their own pedagogies. And they've taken a look at how language is used within the picture books, but it's also been good to help those that are much less proficient in English, but they're in secondary schools, because the pictures allow them to construct their own narratives, and that gives a much more personal approach to the language that they do know. They're able to show what they can achieve by using the pictures to construct a narrative that enables language development. So it's looking at how these picture books can be used in different ways, and he tends to not only be able to explore those concepts with primary students but with secondary students, and so they're quite applicable right across the piece. So I think questions that teachers could raise in order to broaden, so that it's not just a band-aid, but you're developing the higher order thinking skills, are looking at how identity is constructed within the text, whose interest is the text written, in whose interest, who's disadvantaged by this type of text. So all the messages and concepts that are within the narratives or within the pictures can be explored in first language use and also in English as they're learning, but it can be then gauged at different proficiency levels because it's allowing a more personal response to an engagement with the text.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Does anybody want to add anything about that? Please, Constant.
Okay, I think I'm back. Right. Thank you, Yvonne. Very useful ideas. Let me just supplement a little bit in relation to the use of stories and reading and so on, but with particular interest in the promotion of multilingualism. There is a body of multilingual books that that has been designed specifically for use by basically young children who are learning using different languages. And on the website, if you go to Global Storybooks, you'll pretty much get there. And it's a set of materials based on a body of curated African stories, but it's now read, well, it's been actually carefully edited and, well, translated, interpreted, and edited carefully. And there are, from memory, more than maybe 40 or so languages. So the same story would be available in different languages with the same content, with the same quality of production and the sound quality and so on. So it's extremely flexible set of activities. And the stories are graded for age as well, so that you could go from very young age to, I think, pretty much close to junior secondary years, okay? And it's an extremely flexible set of materials. You could use it for family literacy reasons. So you can have, for example, a story read in English by, let's say, a child who knows the story in English, but also you can then look at a home language version of it with the others, the younger ones, and so on. And of course, if you are beginning to do that, then you are kind of consciously thinking about multilingualism. And I think the key point there is we know for many, many years now, there is a profound relationship between our own languages. So the more we know in one, it's very likely that we can learn and know as much in the other and have a much more efficient way of learning. So this would be an opportunity, given that, you know, we are talking about people spending loads of time with their family members, and that they obviously would share some sort of common language or languages. And so these multilingual materials would be very useful at this time for reading, and also for, I think Yvonne might see what I'm trying to get at, a kind of highly conscious reading of meanings in different languages, even though the story is the same. But when you look at the actual words and the meanings, they might actually signal slightly different sentiments, different shades of meaning and so on. And that would also be very interesting, because the same story, everybody can take different meaning from it, and you can talk about it in more than one language. And so that's a tremendous set of resources. And it's a body of work organized by a colleague at the University of British Columbia, Bonnie Norton. And so if you either Google Bonnie Norton or Global Storybooks, you'll find your way there. But we'll put some stuff, we'll send Catherine some stuff. In the last issue of EAL Journal, there's a piece on that with an interview with Bonnie Norton herself, talking about the uses and the value of multilingualism. So we'll send that forward to Catherine, and then we'll circulate this again. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much, Constant. Right, let's move onto the live questions.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. Although we're looking at questions with a much more inquiry-based approach, when we're thinking of teachers changing their pedagogic approach, just going back to something Kamil was talking about, simple things that we often do as EAL teachers in terms of activities with gap fill, with a complex text or a picture or a text that's linked to the picture books. You can do the gap fill where teachers are having to say, ask the question, give reasons for the words changing or give reasons for the grammar changing. So you're taking it much back down to a ground level for those that are needing some scaffolding in terms of grammar or vocabulary. And the inquiry-based approach in grammar then asks the learner to provide a reason for language changing, and it helps them to take on board the reasons or how language works and why it's working a particular way. It starts them engaging with that. So I think pedagogies that teachers develop, that we work with, we'll start to embed those, and this is an opportunity for them to start to think about their practice in very different ways. There's also an activity or an app or a website called Rainbow Bridge, I think it's called, and it provides lots of different activities for life in Rome and Britain. So it's not just linked to certain subject areas. There's a number of different subject areas, and there's also language differences that you can sign up in order to promote the multilingual approach. And Oxford OUP, I think, also has resources that I've used, or some of my student teachers have used, where they give you the whole text, and then it's a simplified novel or a book, and it can be in different subject areas around different things, but the questions that they ask are really good to get learners thinking about language, thinking not only about comprehension in terms of what the message is in the text, but the language and how it's constructed and why certain words are used. So I would look at OUP for simplified readers, and although we would only use those at certain points, they can be a good scaffold.
Can't hear you, Silvana. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to, it was just delightful hearing Yvonne talk there about what is basically great pedagogy. And I wanted to make a point that although we're sitting here talking about effective pedagogy for EAL, this is actually great pedagogy for all your children, because it's essentially dialogic. It draws on what we know about, what works well in terms of being language rich. It chimes with initiatives like Talk for Writing or Voice 21 that schools are already engaged with. So I think we said right at the outset, EAL pedagogy is not an add-on. It's about a really rich pedagogy that actually works for all your children and monolingual speakers as well.
Okay. Naomi, sorry, stay with me because there's a question from the chat now for you. So from Pippa, Naomi, how might we support students who have limited to no access to the internet, as well as having low levels of literacy?
I mean, I think in a way we've covered a lot of that, haven't we? We've talked about the fact that teachers are doing things like actually phoning families, like actually visiting families. I'm not suggesting that that's possible for any or all of us, but I think there are no easy get-arounds with that. I know that Yvonne's mentioned that she knows her teachers who are dropping off hard copy packs of work at school, and children then come and pick them up. I think it's the normal workarounds that you would usually use for any of your children in any situation who didn't have access to the internet, to be honest.
Another question, open probably to Naomi, Kamil, any of you really. What is your opinion on continuing phonics through secondary?
I mean, this is about EAL. I mean, I'm a phonics enthusiast, so I'd say if children don't understand the letter sound correspondences between, phonemes and their graphemes, then yes, they need it. But that's a very easy, glib answer. There's lots of complexity in there that I don't have time to talk about now.
Yeah, sure. Some of the secondary pupils that I've worked with in schools recently were confused by, for example, one was a Thai student and was obviously having difficulty with the certain sounds in Thai that were phonetic, that looked a similar letter in English to Thai but had a different sound. But one of the things that we were encouraging student teachers to do with phonics was part of Eve Gregory's work. And it was to help them so that it wasn't just an isolated vocabulary word or an isolated letter, was to choose words that were meaningful to them, that they wanted to learn, in order to support the interaction with the word and with the phonics approach, so that the words became meaningful and the learning of the sounds linked to the words were something that they would embed in their own thinkings. But it had to be something it's about that personal engagement again. That can be with a text or a letter, or a word, and it's how they.
Great, thank you, Yvonne. A question I think for Kamil now, and this is from Mariel. Can you recommend? Sorry, can you recommend any engaging resources to build academic vocabulary for stage C, band C and above pupils? So fluent, competent, etc.
There are some resources, but I'm sort of a little bit worried that it might be difficult to get a hold now. Just simply, so there are some resources books. So there's a gentleman that unfortunately passed away a few years ago called Graham Workman. And he has produced a couple of books along those lines. One of them is essentially called CLIL, Maths and Science, and they are essentially sort of just full of photocopyable resources, including a CD that you could also sort of print from, or perhaps these days turn them into PDFs for the learners and send them over. And they are essentially focused on sort of merging the two, blending content and language, and so this is certainly one of those. I think I saw that Naomi wanted to come in, so perhaps I'll.
Oh yeah, no, don't stop, Kamil. Are you okay? Yeah, no,
Naomi.
Oh, okay. I was just going to flag the Bell Foundation's wonderful Great Ideas page, which I've talked about several times in the chat line already. I mean, I think the Great Ideas page has all sorts of activities on it, like darts, directed activities related to text, which are brilliant for building from kind of competent to increasing fluency children's vocabulary.
Thank you. One last question from the chat for Naomi or Kamil from Hannah. What would you include as key pieces of work in home learning packs for EAL children?
Okay.
You go first, Kamil.
Can I go first? So yeah, I spotted the question a couple of minutes ago in the chat. So I thought. I imagine we are talking here about Band A learners, because obviously EAL is a larger group. But if that's, because I think we would have to have different sort of packs if we are thinking, about Band A and Band C, for example, because that would be very different. However, if we're talking about Band A, I would first of all ensure that whatever we do send is always linked to the curriculum. So, for instance, in terms of so I would like to sort of see different sort of subjects covered, certainly in secondary. So the kind of resource that I was just talking about could be used as one. There's also, if you have access to a CD called Racing to English, that's a fantastic set of resources that actually would be able to be done without necessarily huge amounts of interaction between the learners and the teachers, in the sense that they are worksheets that go for 3 pages. They link speaking to writing very often. They have been so, and they are actually kind of built around different sort of subjects as well. So so that would be one that I would definitely suggest. I would look at the collaborative learning project websites, in the sense that if your learners have the ability at home to print some of the things, and then they could be turned into, be done together with the parents or perhaps the other families. So that's and they're all, and again, those resources are provided for primary and secondary and even early years stage as well. So I would sort of try to cover lots of different subjects and think about, but perhaps focus on 1 or 2. So because that's the way I organize my induction program when I was there. It's just taking different ones. So these are just 3 examples I can think of right now.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants. There's been quite a lot of activity in terms of making suggestions, so we're really thankful for that. So now it's time for concluding thoughts from each of the members of the panel. So starting with Naomi, then Kamil,
do a big shout out for teachers, really. As I know we clap for the NHS
Naomi?
every Thursday rightly, but I'd like to clap for you too, and for giving your time up for being here this afternoon. It's been delightful watching the chat and the amount of brilliant ideas coming through from you. You're obviously, you know, really engaged and thinking about your learners, and I don't know what else we could ask from that, so thank you.
Yes, well, I would say the same.
Kamil?
I would I sort of consider myself slightly lucky in the sense that my daughter is only 4, and so she doesn't go to school yet. So I can just, so you know, I'm also thinking about all of those of you who have your own children around, and you need to be working from home. So thank you very much from myself as well. I think, first of all, we had huge amounts of resources shared in the chat room as well, and I think what I would say is that try to use the resources that are already there, and the kind of resources that's you know, things like TED Talks and that sort of thing, and YouTube, something that is already present, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, because obviously you will not have time for that. But yes, that's what I would say. And I would also add, just as a final thought, that's I think what I would suggest is whatever it is that we do, including with Band A learners, that we would try to combine teaching content and language in that contextualized way, however best we can.
I'd just like to say I've really enjoyed the forum and been able to interact with you, and I've enjoyed watching the comments too. Some really good ideas that I'll take back to my own teachers. And I think that's what I like about being part of a community like this, is the way that we support each other. But I'd like to reiterate what Naomi has said too, and the fact that teachers are my heroes in life. And I think that you do a great job. And I think the very fact that your heart is there, wanting to meet needs within a variety of ways, and thinking of all the different situations you find your students in, is something to be commended. And I would just like to thank you for attending and for listening to us. And if you've got any great ideas, can you send them to me so that I can help to support my student teachers? Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. And Constant? Mike, Constant, we can't hear you.
I'm going to learn this trick. Anyway, thank you very much. Wonderful ideas and lots of great professional insights. Seems to me that many of the questions are to do with how do you make the curriculum content accessible to pupils who are at relatively early stages of learning English as an additional language. And I think this is really very much at the heart of what we do, because if our pupils have to develop their English through the content area, through their ordinary classrooms, where they have to, as it were, pick up a lot of English with the support of the teachers, then the idea of content language integrated teaching, I think, is very important. I'm not going to say any more because my colleagues have said pretty much everything that I would like to endorse. Suffice it to say that I have some very old material developed by colleagues many years ago on exactly this topic. And so what I'll do is I'll talk with Kathleen and Silvana, see how we can make that sort of freely available material available to people. These are mostly easy to read books. And there's one that, for example, talks about how you develop a set of teaching material, like key vocabulary and key concepts from a subject like maths and a subject like science, and so on. And these are sort of small booklets. I'll try to, I think they have all come out of copyrights anyway now because they're quite old. So if possible, we'll make those accessible to colleagues. And so, you know, people can go and do a little bit of thinking and develop their own professionalism and so on. And the other thing I want to give a plug to is, if we learn nothing else, the current initiative to cancel the GCSEs and A-levels, I think it's a very good lesson for us to actually do really good teacher assessment, because that's what the government's asking us to do now. And I'll say no more, being an interested party, but I'm sure Silvana can make a lot more out of this. But the important thing is to draw a distinction between language proficiency in English and content understanding. English language learners often understand a lot more than what they can say. And so picking up from Naomi and Kamil's discussions earlier, it's quite important to actually focus on what they can understand and what they can do first before make a judgment on how much they have achieved, because a lot of the achievement is understanding. And the language part is what we do to express what we understand, but it's not everything that we understand. I dare say there are things that I understand I still can't say. And that's after many years of learning English. So have a thought for our pupils. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constant, and thank to each of you for agreeing to be on the panel and for sharing your expertise so generously with us and for your great ideas and insights. I'm going to round up now, but before we close this webinar, I wanted to remind you first of all that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar, a survey and a blog post. David, would you mind opening the PowerPoint so that I can share with you a couple of pieces of information about resources that we both the NALDIC and the Bell Foundation have put together, and events as well that are forthcoming. Thank you very much. So, forthcoming events from the Bell Foundation. On April the 30th, there's a full day of webinars on the topic of supporting the home learning of EAL pupils. So we'll have a 60-minute focus on primary at 11 o'clock. Again, a 1-hour session on secondary at 2 o'clock. And at 4 o'clock, as Constant was saying, we need to say quite a lot about assessing learning. So we've got a whole session as well devoted to that topic. If you want to find out more about it or book a place, just check the website, the Bell Foundation website. NALDIC would like to let you know that there will be summer term regional interest group meetings, and these will take place online and they will be free. The next one coming up is the Oxfordshire Regional Interest Group on April the 30th, and again, the link is there for you. The second announcement is that the annual NALDIC conference will take place, but it will be online, so exciting times, on November the 2nd, and if you want to find out more about it, check the NALDIC website. There will be details coming soon. In terms of information and resources, we just wanted to share with you that the Bell Foundation has just launched a series of EAL guidance videos which offer guidance and strategies specific to the current home learning context. And we also published a list of recommended resources, particularly with a focus on extensive reading, listening and speaking, and they're both curriculum and language focused. NALDIC also, if you check the EAL Journal blog, it has ideas for teachers and parents of EAL learners during lockdown. And if you look at the EAL Journal website, you can find them there. So thank you everybody so much for taking part in today's webinar, and thanks very much again Naomi, Kamil, Yvonne and Constant for giving us your time and sharing your ideas with us. We will stop